I came back early from the business trip. The clock on the car dashboard said 10:45 p.m., and I was thinking about how good it would be to surprise my wife that night. We had been apart for weeks, the messages were short, the phone calls were quick, always with excuses. But I was determined to change that. We would buy a bottle of expensive wine, open a nice dinner, and finally I would have time to talk, to make up for what we were missing. I arrived home. Everything was dark, silent. Which seemed strange to me, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was tired, already asleep. I walked to the door with my heart racing, a mixture of anxiety and relief at finally being back. But, as I approached, something broke that expectation. A muffled sound, laughter. Laughter that wasn't mine. I stopped in front of the door. My heart, which had previously been beating anxiously, now seemed to be hammering inside my chest. I pushed the door open carefully, trying not to make any noise, and what I saw there, in that room, was something I can never forget. She was there. Not alone. I watched for seconds that felt like an eternity. The way she looked at him, as if that man were the center of her world. They were laughing about something. An intimacy that I no longer knew. It wasn't just a physical affair, it was a complete, emotional, devastating betrayal. I swallowed hard. I didn't make a fuss, I didn't come in screaming. That would have been the easiest, perhaps even the most anticipated. But all I could feel was an overwhelming cold, as if something inside me had been ripped away. All the trust, all the history we had built, evaporated there, at that moment, and I was alone, witnessing the end of something that I didn't even know had already ended. Then, she saw me. Our eyes met, and for a brief second, I could see the panic in her eyes. But it soon dissolved into something I would never have expected. Maybe it was relief, or who knows, confusion about what I should feel at that moment. The unsuspecting lover also turned around. Surprise took over his face, but neither of them said anything. I was about to explode, but I controlled myself. What would be a dignified way out at that moment? I knew what I would do. Enjoy it and keep it, he said, without looking away from her. I'm leaving and I'm going to keep all the assets. The words came out cool, controlled, even though my world was crumbling inside. She didn't respond. There was nothing to answer. I turned and left the house. I closed the door behind me, leaving behind everything I believed to be my life. But what she didn't know, what he didn't know, was that I still had tricks up my sleeve. Her betrayal was devastating, yes. But it wasn't the end. On the contrary, that moment would be just the beginning of something much bigger. I knew secrets that would change everything. She would regret it. He was nothing but a piece. And what was about to happen would destroy the perfect world she thought she had built behind my back. Now, as I walked away from that house, only one thing pulsed through my mind: how will they react when they find out what's really coming? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and will never accept any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they have a clear objective: to show how betrayal can devastate lives and destroy everything around it. Get ready, because what comes next is an intense story, full of emotions and twists. Get ready to hear a shocking story that will shake you. Good story. The house was silent, shrouded in the dim light of the outside lights that barely illuminated the garden. A welcoming place, built with care over the years, where every detail had been thought of to convey a feeling of stability and security. For Daniel, that home was the symbol of everything he had achieved. Married to Alice for just over 10 years, they formed what, in everyone's eyes, was a perfect couple. He, a successful businessman in the financial sector, she, a university professor, respected and admired by her students. They were the couple that many envied. They were always at the right parties, they knew the right people and, apparently, they had the right life. But inside, things were no longer as perfect as they seemed. Daniel has always been dedicated to his work, passionate about the idea of providing his family with a comfortable and safe life. He grew up with little and had sworn that his family wouldn't go through the same thing. This dedication, however, began to take its toll. The time spent at the office increased, while the time spent at home decreased. Over the past 2 years, his business trips had become more frequent, and he increasingly noticed that Alice seemed to withdraw. Conversations were short, dinners were silent, and even the simple touch of hands no longer brought that comfortable familiarity. Alice, in turn, felt alone. She never questioned Daniel's love, but over time, she began to wonder if he was still present at the wedding. Always busy with her classes and the demands of university, she tried to fill the void with work, but at night, when she was alone in that large and silent house, loneliness consumed her. It was hard for her to admit, but something had changed between them. What had once been a marriage full of passion and complicity now seemed more like a convenient coexistence. Arguments, once rare, became more frequent, and what were once just small disagreements turned into long periods of silence. Daniel noticed the change, but didn't know how to deal with it. He wanted to believe it was a phase, that with time things would return to normal. His focus was always on the next trip, the next contract, and he convinced himself that he was doing what was best for his family by ensuring financial stability. He knew Alice was unhappy, but he always avoided confrontation. He postponed important conversations, pretended not to notice her distant looks, and so time passed, with both of them increasingly isolated in their own bubbles of frustration and resentment. Los Angeles was a city where ambition and success were written everywhere, and Daniel was part of that cycle. Professional success came with a cost. He was always on the move, involved in meetings, events and commitments that kept him away from home. Alice, on the other hand, became increasingly involved in academic activities. University was a refuge, but also a distraction. She stood out as a teacher, was admired by her students and respected by her colleagues. However, outside of the classroom, she felt empty. The days passed in a monotonous succession of obligations, while the marriage that had once been the foundation of his life now seemed a distant shadow. Alice's friends noticed the change. In occasional encounters, she seemed distracted, always with short answers and a forced smile. They asked how Daniel was, and Alice responded with the same phrase as always, "He's traveling, as always." And so, life went on, with both avoiding looking at the abyss that was beginning to open between them. Their relationship, once full of life, now seemed stagnant. Moments of intimacy became rare, and when they did happen, they were rushed, devoid of connection. Alice remembered when everything was different, when she and Daniel couldn't wait to be together, when dinners were filled with conversation and laughter. Now the silence weighed more than words. She wondered if there was anything left that could be saved, but she didn't have the courage to confront him. There was fear of discovering that what they felt was true, that they had lost something important along the way. Daniel, on the other hand, was not insensitive to what was happening. He saw the distance growing, but he was stuck in a cycle of work, obligations and excuses. He convinced himself that everything he did was for Alice, for them, but at some point, he stopped realizing that the material success he sought could not fill the emotional void that had arisen between them. Sometimes, on lonely hotel nights, he wondered what had happened. When did they stop being that inseparable team, that couple that everyone admired? But, like Alice, he was afraid to look for the answer. Daniel's travels were always surrounded by promises. Promises that when he returned, they would have more time, that they would take that trip they had been putting off for years, that they would sit and talk like they used to. But each time he returned, the cycle began again. Alice, already accustomed to the comings and goings, no longer expected these promises. They had become empty, echoes of a past she no longer believed could be recovered. And it was in this scenario of distance and silence that something began to change. A message here, a smile there, and, without realizing it, Alice found herself involved in something she would never have imagined. It wasn't something she was looking for, but somehow it offered her relief, a distraction from the monotonous life she led. There were no plans, no promises, just an escape. Daniel, in turn, noticed that something was different when he returned from one of his trips. Alice was more distant, but she also seemed more excited in a way. He tried to ignore it, believing that perhaps it was just a figment of his own imagination, but the uneasiness began to grow. Every little detail now seemed like an indication that something bigger was happening. He tried to rationalize, but the discomfort wouldn't leave him. The silence between them was becoming unbearable. The house, which was once a refuge, now seemed like a prison of memories and broken promises. And deep down, Daniel knew something big was coming. He just didn't know what, or when, but the feeling that the ground was about to collapse beneath his feet wouldn't leave him. What Daniel and Alice still didn't understand was that that moment of growing tension was about to culminate in a twist that would change everything forever. The marriage that they both believed was deteriorating due to routine issues hid something much deeper and more painful. The following days seemed to flow like a carefully rehearsed routine. Daniel continued to be immersed in work, dedicating himself to meetings and planning trips, while Alice maintained her schedule at the university, busying herself with academic projects and activities. But for both of them, there was something out of place. It was as if a shadow hung over the house, a silent tension that neither of them dared to confront directly. Daniel, always observant, began to notice small details. Things that would previously have gone unnoticed now seemed to scream for attention. Alice's frequent departures, the text messages that she responded to quickly and with an expression he hadn't seen in a while. There was a gleam in her eyes, but it wasn't for him. When she smiled, that smile he loved so much, something was missing, or rather, something was different. He didn't know what, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong followed him like a shadow, a thought that wouldn't leave him alone. Their conversations became shorter and shorter, punctuated by uncomfortable silences. Alice was always busy, in a hurry, and he didn't know how to bring up what was bothering him so much. Was it paranoia? He tried to convince himself that yes, he was just stressed about work, and that things would soon work out. But the emptiness in his chest only grew. One night, while they were having dinner, Daniel watched Alice more closely. She talked about her day, about her students, but he barely heard the words. His mind was focused on small details, the way she avoided looking him directly in the eyes, the way she always seemed to be somewhere else, far away, even though she was there, sitting in front of him. He tried to break the ice, make a joke, but her smile was superficial, without the warmth it had been before. Something was undoubtedly wrong. The next morning, he decided he needed to get that feeling out of his head. He would return to work, to the frenetic pace that kept him busy, and try to forget the suspicions that tormented him. But as the day progressed, the thoughts persisted. He tried calling Alice in the middle of the afternoon, an attempt to reconnect, to hear her voice, but the call went to voicemail. She did not return the call. When he got home that night, Alice was already asleep. Or at least pretended to be. The body motionless, the face turned away. Daniel stood still for a few minutes, watching his wife with a growing weight in his chest. That feeling of loss, that something precious was slipping from his hands and he was powerless to stop it, consumed him. The days continued like this, with Daniel becoming more and more restless. Until, one morning, he received an unexpected message from work. The trip he had planned for the following week would be postponed. An opportunity. Maybe it was the sign he needed to get closer to Alice, to try to recover what they had lost. That afternoon, Daniel decided he would surprise Alice. He would get home early, prepare a special dinner, something they hadn't done in a while. Maybe this would reconnect them. Maybe, with a night without distractions, they could finally talk, understand what was happening between them. He left work early, his heart a little lighter at the idea. He stopped at a wine store and bought the most expensive bottle he could find. On his way back, he imagined the moment, Alice walking through the door, surprised to see him there, dinner served, the atmosphere becoming light again, like old times. But when I got home, something was different. Alice's car was not in the garage. He looked at the clock and realized it was strange that she hadn't returned yet. Maybe he was in a meeting or had been late at university, he thought. He tried not to care, going into the house and starting to prepare dinner. As he cut the vegetables, however, the restlessness grew again. Minutes passed, and Alice didn't arrive. When the clock struck 9 p.m., he could no longer concentrate. He called her, but again it went straight to voicemail. Nervousness took over. He paced back and forth, trying to ignore the discomfort growing inside him. Maybe she was with her friends, maybe she had forgotten something important. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was then that he heard the sound of the front door opening. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He took 2 steps towards the corridor, ready to welcome Alice with the smile he had rehearsed, but what he saw stopped him. Alice was not alone. She entered, smiling, accompanied by a man Daniel had never seen before. The shock prevented him from moving. They laughed, talked in whispers, completely oblivious to his presence. The scene in front of him was devastating. There was no doubt, there was no room for misunderstanding. He watched them for a few seconds that felt like hours, feeling the ground crumble beneath his feet. Alice touched the man with a familiarity that made him want to scream. Her fingers slid down his arm in a way she hadn't done with him in a long time. Daniel couldn't believe it. The world around him seemed to spin as he tried to process what his eyes saw. The silence in the room was broken when Alice finally noticed her presence. Her smile instantly disappeared, her eyes widened, and the man next to her, confused, turned to face him. Daniel, with his face on fire and his chest tight, just said, with frightening calm, "Enjoy it and keep it, I'm leaving and I'll keep all the assets." The words hung in the air, filled with a coldness that hid the storm within him. Alice opened her mouth, trying to say something, but no sound came out. The lover next to her didn't seem to understand the gravity of what was happening. Daniel, without waiting for another answer, turned on his heel and walked out the door, leaving behind not only his home, but what was left of his marriage. The door closed behind Daniel with a muffled bang. The world around him seemed to be in slow motion, but inside him everything pulsed, boiled with anger and pain. The image of Alice, laughing with that man, stuck in his mind like an open wound. He didn't know where to go, his hands shook as he searched his pocket for his car keys. It wasn't just the physical betrayal that destroyed him, but the fact that it hadn't happened suddenly. Their relationship was already in shambles, and now everything he had built was falling apart. As he drove through the dark streets, his mind spiraled with questions. When did everything change? How did he not notice how far Alice had strayed? But more than that, why didn't he do anything sooner? The silence in the car was suffocating, the only thing that could be heard was the sound of the engine and the echo of the words he had left behind. Enjoy it and keep it. The bitter taste of the words was still in his mouth, but he knew there was something more. Something that had been bothering him since those strange weeks began. Alice wasn't just a distant wife, she had changed. Her attitudes, the way she avoided him, the lightness with which she dealt with everything in the last few months, and he, blind, did nothing. His mistake wasn't just trusting too much, it was not acting when he felt something was wrong. His cell phone vibrated on the passenger seat, but he didn't answer it. I knew it was Alice. Either she would call to justify herself, or, more likely, she would apologize. That thought made him grip the steering wheel tighter. There would be no room for excuses now. What was done could not be undone. Daniel drove aimlessly for over an hour, until the adrenaline began to wear off and he finally allowed himself to think about what came next. The words he uttered were not just an empty threat. He was determined to follow through on what he had said. All assets would remain with him. And she should stay with her lover, if that was what she wanted. With this firm decision, he returned home early in the morning, his body exhausted, but his mind buzzing. Alice was there, sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. Upon seeing him, she stood up immediately, but Daniel didn't say anything. He walked past her, ignoring her presence, and went up to his room. There wasn't an exchange of words, but he knew the conversation they needed to have would come sooner or later. The next day, Daniel woke up before dawn. Alice's bags were still there, intact, as if what had happened the night before wasn't real. He took a deep breath, quickly dressed and went down to the kitchen. Alice was at the table, a cup of coffee in her hands, staring blankly into space. The silence between them was heavy, but Daniel knew he could no longer delay the inevitable. He sat across from her, crossing his arms on the table, not looking away. Alice, on the other hand, avoided looking at him. His fingers nervously played with the rim of the cup. The silence lasted for a few minutes until she finally spoke, her voice low and shaky. "Daniel, I'm sorry. I don't even know where to start." He remained silent, watching her. He felt a mix of anger and curiosity. Apologies weren't what he wanted to hear. He wanted to understand. "I don't know what happened to us," she continued, her voice breaking. "I was lost, we both were. I felt alone, and he showed up, and I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think about anything." Daniel let out a short, bitter laugh, the sound unexpected in the midst of the tension. He shook his head in disbelief. "Haven't you thought about the consequences?" He finally broke the silence, his voice hard, cold. "Didn't you think about how that would destroy everything?" "I was here, Alice. I always have been. We weren't perfect, but I never imagined you would do this. Never." She lowered her head, silent tears falling into the now cold coffee. "I know there are no excuses for what I did. I lost myself, Daniel. That's my fault. I don't want to lose you. I know I've already hurt you too much, but—" Daniel interrupted, anger rising within him again. "Did it hurt too much? You ended everything. It's not just about us. It's about who we were. What we built. You destroyed it. I gave you everything, Alice. And you just threw it away." She sobbed, unable to defend herself. "I knew he was right. There was no way to justify what she did. But still, I needed to try to explain." She needed him to understand, at least part of it. "I know it's too late to ask for forgiveness, but I just wanted you to know that." I was confused. Alice looked up, for the first time looking directly at Daniel. "He doesn't mean anything. It never meant. It was a mistake. It was a momentary relief, but I know that doesn't excuse what I did." Daniel stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back with such force that it almost tipped over. He walked to the window, trying to control the anger he felt. "A momentary relief?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. "How could you do this to me? With us?" Silence fell again, filled only by Alice's muffled sobs. Daniel, staring out the window, tried to think about everything they had been through together, everything they had built. "But, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't see that marriage in the same way anymore. Betrayal had broken something that could never be restored." When he finally spoke again, his voice was calm but cold. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Alice. And honestly, I don't know if I want to. What you did, there is no going back." Alice got up from the table, approaching Daniel. She hesitated for a moment, and then lightly touched his arm, as if that gesture would be enough to bring back what they had lost. "I understand if you want to leave me. I know you have every right to do this." His voice was full of despair. "But please, Daniel, don't do this out of anger. Think about what we built, think about what we were. Don't let this destroy everything." Daniel pulled away from her touch, shaking his head slowly. "Everything is already destroyed, Alice. You destroyed it." She cried more intensely now, sobs racking her body, but Daniel didn't move to comfort her. He couldn't. The pain inside him was unbearable, and all he wanted was distance from that situation. Distance from Alice. Distance from everything she had represented. That's when Alice's cell phone rang. She hurriedly picked it up, her hands shaking, staring at the screen for a few seconds before turning it off. Daniel, who until then had been struggling to maintain control, noticed the hesitation. Something about the way Alice reacted made a wave of distrust hit him again. "Who was it?" he asked, dryly. Alice hesitated, looking away. "No one important, just work." Daniel knew she was lying. There was something more to that call, something she didn't want him to know. The betrayal was already exposed, but that moment made him realize there was something more. A secret that still hung in the air, something that Alice tried to hide at all costs. He looked at her, his face hardened, his eyes fixed on hers, and then he realized, the betrayal wasn't just physical. There was more behind those tears and apologies. Much more. "Alice, what are you hiding?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but firm, with an undertone of threat that made her shiver. She remained silent, her hand still clutching her cell phone tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if the answer was something she was afraid to say out loud. And, at that moment, Daniel knew that the worst was yet to come. The silence between Daniel and Alice continued to hover around the room, heavy and dense, as if the air was filled with something invisible, but impossible to ignore. The unspoken secret remained between them, pulsing with a silent force, making any attempt at communication fragile and painful. Daniel's gaze never moved from Alice, and she, in turn, avoided looking at him at all costs. It was as if she knew that the next truth to be revealed would be no return. "Alice," Daniel repeated, this time lower, almost in a whisper, "what are you hiding from me?" Alice shifted uncomfortably, fidgeting with the cell phone in her hands as if it anchored her to reality. For a few seconds, she remained silent, biting her lower lip, trying to find the right words. But Daniel knew that whatever came next, it wouldn't be simple. He no longer had any illusions about her honesty, but something in her behavior made him feel that what was coming would be even more devastating than the betrayal she had already admitted. Finally, Alice looked up. The face was marked by tears, and the expression of despair was clear. She seemed cowed before him, as if she knew that no matter what she said, the impact would be irreversible. "Daniel," she began, her voice shaking, fragile, I really didn't want things to get to this point. I never planned for it to be like this, for us to come to this." She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "But, she hesitated again, as if the words were weighing too much. "He told me things, made me believe that everything was okay, that, you would never know. That I could just get on with our lives and that what we had was, different." Daniel, who until then had been watching without reaction, took a step forward. There was a mixture of anger and curiosity in her eyes, but he felt there was something deeper. Something Alice wasn't saying. "Alice, you're fooling me. What did he do? What did you do?" He insisted, his voice now filled with an impatience that made it clear that his tolerance was at its limit. She took another deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment before continuing. I transferred money to him, Daniel. A lot of money." His voice broke at the end, almost imperceptible, but enough for Daniel to understand the extent of the damage. "I didn't want to, at first. He convinced me. He said it would be temporary, that he would return it as soon as," she hesitated, not knowing how to continue. Daniel was silent for a few seconds, absorbing what he had just heard. Money. He blinked, trying to reorganize his thoughts. In an instant, the betrayals, the lies, and now, the financial devastation, everything seemed to fall apart at once. "How much, Alice?" His voice was now an icy thread, a forced calm that only masked the chaos that was beginning to form inside him. She bit her lip again, looking down. "Almost $100,000, the confession came out, breaking the silence of the room like thunder. $100,000. Daniel felt his stomach sink. It wasn't just the amount that got to him, but the fact that she had done it behind his back, without him suspecting anything. He, who had always taken care of his finances, who had always believed he was in control, now found himself betrayed on more than one level. It wasn't just the physical and emotional betrayal, it had damaged what he valued most, their future, the hard work he had built over the years. "Are you telling me that," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "In addition to cheating on me with him, you were also financing, what? His lifestyle? Were you stealing from me, Alice?" She shook her head quickly, the tears coming back with more force now. "No, it wasn't like that. I didn't steal from you. I was lost, Daniel. He made me believe this was the only solution. He needed the money, and I wanted to help. I thought this would be over soon, that he would pay me back. But then I couldn't stop. He manipulated me, and I was stuck with it. I never wanted to harm you." Alice's words sounded desperate, but for Daniel, it was all irrelevant. She hadn't just betrayed his trust, had put the future they had built together at risk. He felt a rising fury, a wave of indignation that made him want to scream, but at the same time he was paralyzed. How did things get to this point? What disturbed him most was the ease with which Alice seemed to be manipulated. How could someone he knew so well, or thought he knew, allow himself to fall into such a deep hole? Did she really believe everything that man said? Or was there more? Did she also want to escape that life? "You know what that means, don't you?" Daniel asked, his voice now cold and calculated. "This means that you not only destroyed our marriage, but you also compromised everything I worked to build. Our home, our future, everything." Alice sobbed, shaking her head in denial. "I can fix it, Daniel. I can get the money back. I'll do whatever it takes. But Daniel didn't listen to her anymore. He walked away, thoughts swirling in his head. He knew this revelation was just the beginning. The betrayal had opened a wound too deep to be healed with excuses and empty promises. And now, knowing that she had put their finances and their future at risk, there was no going back. "This is over, Alice," Daniel said, with a firmness in his voice that made her stop crying for a moment. "There is nothing left to save here." She looked at him with wide, desperate eyes. "No, please, Daniel. It doesn't say that. We can get through this. I can fix everything. I promise." But Daniel shook his head, anger and exhaustion evident in his every movement. "You've already destroyed everything we had," he said, finally making it clear what he felt. "And now, all I have left is to deal with the consequences." Alice collapsed to the floor, wrapped in her own despair, while Daniel, once again, turned his back and left. But this time, when he left, he knew there was no going back. What was left now was a fragmented life, with pieces scattered along a path he never expected to follow. The days that followed that confrontation were unbearably silent. Daniel had completely distanced himself from Alice, without any willingness for dialogue or reconciliation. The decision had already been made. He began to live like a ghost inside his own house, where every corner seemed to remind him of how much his life had changed. He moved mechanically, preparing the necessary documentation to ensure that all the assets would remain with him, just as he had promised in the heat of the moment. Alice, in turn, was still in the house, but she was no longer the same person. His eyes, once full of confidence, were now empty, marked by despair. She knew she had destroyed everything, knew there was nothing left to be said that could repair the damage. Still, she tried, in a last effort, to talk to Daniel about the possibility of a second chance, about a different future, but he always cut her off. "There is no more us, Alice. There is no turning back," Daniel always repeated, his voice cold and definitive. Daniel's decision was clear, he would move forward. The assets, the joint accounts, everything was now under his control. He moved with the precision of a surgeon, eliminating any trace of Alice from his financial life. She, who until recently occupied a central space in his life, was now just a shadow of the past. Alice knew she couldn't fight it anymore. The lover she had chosen over her husband had disappeared as soon as the money stopped flowing. He, who once seemed like an outlet for her frustration and loneliness, had abandoned her at the moment she needed him most. The empty promises that he would fix everything and return the money were never fulfilled, and Alice was now alone, ruined, both emotionally and financially. His academic career also began to fall apart as his name circulated among his colleagues. People talked, and the judgmental looks became constant. The burden of betrayal, previously hidden, was now a weight she would have to carry forever. Daniel, on the other hand, tried to move on, but the feeling of betrayal followed him like a shadow. With every step he took, the memory of Alice and what she had done gnawed at him. It wasn't just the end of his marriage that tormented him, but the fact that he had allowed himself to trust blindly, that he had been manipulated for years without realizing it. He had built a life based on a lie, and now, with everything undone, he wondered if he could ever trust anyone again. He sold the house. That place that had been his refuge for so long was now just a painful reminder of everything he had lost. He didn't want to stay there any longer. He couldn't stand the echoes of the past that resonated in every room, in every piece of furniture. Everything needed to be erased. The day of moving arrived, and Daniel, as he left the house for the last time, looked one last time at the place where, for so many years, he believed he had been happy. There was no more hurt, no more anger. There was just an emptiness, a recognition that that part of his life was buried. He didn't know what the future held, but he was certain, he would never allow that to happen again. Alice, on the other hand, couldn't move on. Shame and guilt consumed her in ways she had never anticipated. Everything he had done, all the wrong choices, now came to the surface relentlessly. She lost her job, lost the respect of her colleagues and friends, and, worst of all, lost herself. The money she transferred to her lover was never recovered, and she found herself in a desperate situation, with no clear path to start over. Eventually, Alice moved to a small apartment, far from everything she knew. Loneliness was now his only company. She didn't reach out to Daniel again, knowing he would never forgive her, and deep down, she knew she didn't deserve forgiveness. The days became monotonous and empty, a sequence of regrets and memories that constantly haunted her. The price of her shares was high, and she would have to live with that for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Daniel found a new perspective. After months of solitude and introspection, he began to realize that although the pain of betrayal was still present, he was not destined to be defined by it. He refocused on work, on rebuilding his life, and slowly began to make room for new relationships, albeit with a caution that hadn't existed before. He knew the road to trusting someone again would be long, but this time, he would be more prepared. Alice's betrayal changed him. He had learned, in the most painful way possible, that trust can be broken in an instant, but that the strength to rebuild itself also exists within us. And although there were still scars from what happened, he knew that the future was before him, and that, in time, he would find peace. And so, the story comes to an end. Daniel moved on, stronger, while Alice paid the price for her choices. And now, after following this journey, what did you think of the story? Share your opinion in the comments. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Here, we show the devastating impact that betrayal can have on people's lives. We never support any type of betrayal, and each story is a reminder of how much it can destroy what we have built. Until next time.